Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Classic Comics. Since everything, including the comic shops, is closed due to the Cerveza virus, I have a little time to make some content for the channel besides the reviews that I've been doing. So for this video, I want to express some thoughts on something near and dear to my heart, namely Star Trek. The franchise has been through many ups and downs over the years, but has remained one of the pillars of modern science fiction, at least in terms of television and film. However, I think Star Trek is facing a number of dilemmas that may limit or even bring to an end its position as a pop culture touchstone that represents sci-fi entertainment to the general public. First, let me start by explaining my history with the franchise. I wasn't old enough to see Star Trek when it first aired in September of 1966. I was born in June of '68, shortly after the end of the second season of the original series. And by my first birthday in '69, the show had been canceled. It's now a matter of popular lore that the series went into syndication and became immensely popular. So much so that the show would become more than just a TV series. It became part of the American cultural consciousness in the latter 20th century. The franchise has influenced the development of science and technology in the real world to an extent that no other pop culture property can really claim. Cellular phones, tablets, touch screens, flat screen televisions, all inspired by devices seen on Star Trek. It's no coincidence that the original prototype for NASA's space shuttle was named Enterprise. The cast of the original series was even invited to attend the public unveiling for the first space shuttle. Now, my relationship with Star Trek began somewhere in '74 or '75. It's still one of my more vivid childhood memories. It was in the autumn, I think, a Sunday afternoon. I was bored and looking for something to watch. I was moving through the channels. This was back when you had to actually get up and walk to the TV and switch the channels by hand instead of using a remote. On one channel, I found a story that involved some space travelers who were on a planet and under attack by an unseen enemy. They eventually return to their ship and they pursue their attackers. Then a powerful race of aliens intervenes and places the captains of both ships onto a planet to settle their conflict. Although I wouldn't know the actual name of the episode until years later, it was Arena, the episode in which Captain Kirk fights the Gorn. I watched the show transfixed by Captain Kirk's dilemma. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but had not seen the opening and didn't realize this was a TV series. I assumed it was some old sci-fi movie, and when it ended, it didn't occur to me that there was more to it than what I had seen. A week later, when I was again browsing channels on a Sunday, I found the show again, this time seeing the opening credits and realizing that this was a TV series. I was hooked and became a fan for life. Without getting bogged down in the details, I've seen just about every episode of the original series except maybe 2 or 3. I've seen all the original series movies multiple times, and I like them all to some degree or another, although some of them are clearly flawed. I enjoyed all the subsequent series to some degree, although I'm not a huge fan of Voyager or Enterprise, but they're practically masterpiece theater compared to the more recent versions of Star Trek, the JJ films and the CBS shows Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. The J.J. Abrams films have seen a lot of criticism for a number of reasons, and I won't go into depth on what's wrong with them. Abrams' films are entertaining in a very superficial way. Lots of action, lots of special effects to keep your attention. And the plots move along fairly quickly, which is good. Otherwise, you might stop to think about how none of this makes any sense. I mean, why does Nero wait 20 years to get revenge on Spock by destroying Vulcan, but then immediately dumps Spock on a moon and leaves him there? If you want revenge on someone that much, wouldn't you keep them around so you could see their torment as you destroy their homeworld? Why does Spock dump Kirk on the same moon? Obviously, because that's what the script needs them to do. But that's the problem with Abrams' Star Trek films. People are constantly doing things because the script needs them to, not because it makes any sense or is fitting for their character. There's a whole laundry list of examples of this sort of thing from these films, but I won't go through all of them. This isn't what this video is about. Let's just say that I found Abrams' first Star Trek film to be entertaining, but also kind of dumb. And the subsequent films became less and less entertaining while getting dumber. Which brings us to the current Star Trek shows on CBS All Access, produced by Alex Kurtzman, among others. Much like the Abrams films, these shows have been met with a mixed response from Star Trek fans. Personally, I think they suffer from similar problems as the Abrams films in that the writing on the shows are very flawed. People make decisions and take actions that make little, if any, sense. Then there's the obviously shaky knowledge that the writers of Star Trek Discovery have with even the most basic scientific concepts, such as space being a vacuum and sound or vibrations can't travel through it, as seen in that episode where Burnham thinks they can use a crystal tower to detect cloaked ships. Then again, there's the show's habit of contradicting or ignoring information, or facts that it has already established, such as spending an episode trying to find a way to detect cloaked ships, but then repeatedly detecting cloaked ships anyway. Or when that engineered jet Reno performs complex medical procedures and justifies it by saying that people are just organic machines, so, no big deal. And then a few episodes later, going to the doctor for a hangnail. Then we come to Star Trek Picard. I've done reviews of Picard's first season, so I'll direct you to those for my views on each episode, but in short, Picard has many of the same problems that Star Trek Discovery has. The writing is muddled and sometimes just nonsensical. The Romulans are initially presented as helpless refugees who can't survive without the Federation's help, but then they become the main threat as they attempt to wipe out a colony of synths with a large battle fleet. So which is it? Are they helpless refugees or a powerful enemy with dozens, maybe hundreds of warships? If there was a hidden planet where synths could live in secret without worrying about persecution, then why did Maddox take Soji and Dodge away from there and give them false memories to fool them into thinking that they're human? And why give them a fake mother of some kind to further the illusion? Also, why is Agnes allowed to murder Maddox and then doesn't face any kind of punishment for it, other than Picard scolding her? So yes, Star Trek is in a bad way right now, but even if the issues of the bad writing are resolved somehow, and I don't think they will be anytime soon, Star Trek has other issues that it's facing that endanger its viability as a franchise in the future. As we move further into the 21st century, real-world history is going to increasingly impinge on the imaginary timeline that exists in the Star Trek universe. According to Star Trek history, World War III will occur about 30 years from now, and about 10 years after that, Zefram Cochrane will have his first warp flight, and humans will encounter the Vulcans. So if we make it to, say, 2050, and the events laid out in Star Trek history don't come to pass, do they just move events further into the future? How will that affect the franchise? I think it will impact Star Trek negatively in a number of ways. Take the role of technology in Star Trek. Everyone knows that some of the real-world technologies that have been developed in the last few decades have been influenced by Star Trek. Cellular phones, tablets, flat screens, all were inspired by the technology on Star Trek. But when the real-world technology starts to approximate the technology on Star Trek, the future starts to look outdated. And nothing gets outdated quicker than visions of the future. For example, back in the late 1800s, people were predicting that armies of the 20th century would charge into battle on steam-powered bicycles. Seriously. A good case study to examine here is Buck Rogers. When Buck Rogers was first published as a comic strip in 1929, it gave readers a new vision of what the future would look like. Ray guns, jetpacks, rocket ships, domed cities. It all gave the future a look that people hadn't seen before, and it struck a chord with the public. So much so that Buck Rogers spawned other characters who were thinly disguised copies, Flash Gordon being the most well-known and successful of them. For about 30 years, this was what Americans assumed the future would look like. But then this future world became outdated. So what happened? What happened was technology advanced, And now we had real rockets, and we were sending men out into space for real. And we had real jetpacks. And we realized that since we now had these things in the contemporary real world, the future was surely going to look different. But what would it look like exactly? That's when Star Trek came along and gave Americans a new vision of the future, without rockets and jetpacks. Instead, they had starships, transporters, communicators. Then Star Trek The Next Generation came along and updated Roddenberry's original vision, giving us tablets, touchscreens, and desktop computers. But now we have these things in the real world, so again technology has begun to catch up to our vision of the future. And people are going to start looking at the future Star Trek has given us as outdated and quaint. It might have a certain charm and allure for sci-fi nerds, much in the same way that the sci-fi adventures of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon still do. But it's no longer a vision of the future that inspires or energizes the imagination, that speaks to people or seems relevant to them. Another big issue for Star Trek, potentially, is the technological singularity. The singularity is a speculation about the development of artificial intelligence. The idea is that with the rate at which computing power increases over time, doubling roughly every 18 months, will we be able to create an artificial intelligence that approximates a human mind in the near future? Probably so. But how near? It depends on who you ask, but most experts on the subject seem to put the singularity occurring somewhere around 2030 to 2040. So maybe a decade, maybe 15 years, maybe a little longer. The issue and the danger isn't with creating an AI that equals a human mind. The danger lies in what comes afterward. If computing power doubles roughly every 1.5 years, then about 18 months after we have an AI that's as smart as a human, we'll have an AI that's twice as smart as a human. Now, once we have these super smart AIs, we'll probably start having them design microchips, processors, and AIs as well. When AIs twice as smart as a human begin to design AIs, it's a pretty safe bet that improvements in computing power and artificial intelligence will accelerate the process. How much? We can only speculate, but consider if an AI twice as smart as a human can design an AI that's 4 times as smart as a human and do it in half the time. Now, 9 months later, we have an AI that's 4 times as smart as a human. And that AI designs a new AI that's 8 times as smart as a human and does it in half the time. Now, 4.5 months later, you have an AI that's 8 times as smart as a human, and so on. A little over 2 months later, you have an AI that's 16 times as smart as a human. Then about 3 weeks later, you have an AI that's 32 times as smart as a human. You see where this is going. This is the danger of the singularity, an exponential explosion in artificial intelligence that gets faster and faster to the point that we can't control it anymore. Now, I'm not delving into these matters for a discussion on the wisdom or ethics of creating an AI or the potential dangers. I'm just pointing out another way in which technology in the real world may catch up to and even surpass Star Trek. In the original series, we saw numerous androids, but they were pretty simple-minded. They really didn't think for themselves. They were basically just computers with limbs. But then in Star Trek The Next Generation, we got Data. Data is a sentient android. He can think for himself and is at least, if not significantly so, smarter than a human. Data is presented as an unusual achievement. Only he and other Sung-type androids are this advanced. It's entirely possible that we will have a Data in the real world within our lifetimes, possibly even in the next decade or so. Now, if that happens, what does that do to Star Trek? I think it probably makes Star Trek immediately irrelevant. Now, I should point out that not all futurists and experts agree in these matters, agree about when the singularity will happen, or even if it will happen at all. But it might, and if it does, then there's no telling what will come afterwards. And honestly, at that point, the state of the Star Trek franchise might be the least of our worries. So, where does this all leave Star Trek? It means that Star Trek will need to undergo some significant changes, not just due to changing technology, but due to the history of the real world catching up to Star Trek's fictional world. Take the Terminator franchise, for example. In T2 Judgment Day, the Terminator tells John Connor that Skynet triggers a nuclear holocaust on August 29, 1997. That future was averted. Then we got T3, Rise of the Machines, in which Judgment Day takes place in the summer of 2003. Then we got Terminator Genesis, in which Judgment Day takes place in 2017. They just kept kicking the can down the road, and eventually people just got tired of it. This may not become an issue in my lifetime, but eventually the vision of the future that Star Trek offers will become irrelevant, unless Star Trek undergoes some sort of extensive revision. I'm not saying that the corrupted version of Star Trek that Alex Kurtzman and CBS are offering is the solution. It definitely isn't, but neither is the Star Trek that we grew up watching and loving. Star Trek has always been about looking into the future, and the people who shepherd Star Trek into the coming years, whoever they turn out to be, will need to look there for inspiration. If they don't, or simply can't, then the human adventure may finally be nearing its end. So that's all for now. If you liked this content, then please hit the like button before you leave, and please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.